Imagine for a moment that someone out there is living your life, spending your money, using your name, making decisions that could alter your future forever. This isn't some far-fetched plot from a thriller movie. It's a chilling reality for millions of Americans. Every single year, identity theft affects over 1 in 3 people in this country, with new cases emerging at an alarming rate. That means if you're watching this right now, the odds are startlingly high that you or someone you know has already been touched by this invisible crime. But what if I told you that some of these stories go far beyond stolen credit cards or hacked social media accounts? What if the theft was so bizarre, so utterly unbelievable, that it almost feels like fiction? Welcome to a journey through the shadows of American crime, where truth proves to be stranger than fiction. Today, we're diving deep into the 29 most jaw-dropping, mind-bending cases of identity theft in United States history. These aren't your average tales of financial fraud. These are stories that will make you question reality itself. From impostors who assumed entire lives for decades to cunning criminals who hijacked identities with almost theatrical flair, each case is a window into human ingenuity and sometimes sheer audacity. You'll hear about ordinary people who woke up to find their identities tangled in webs of deception so elaborate they seemed ripped straight from a spy novel. And you'll discover how these deceptions unraveled, often in ways just as unbelievable as the crimes themselves. So settle in and get ready for a ride. This isn't just a list of facts, it's an exploration of the human spirit, both its darkest impulses and its incredible resilience. By the time we're done, you'll see identity theft in a whole new light, and you might just find yourself looking over your shoulder, wondering just how safe your own identity really is. Let's begin with case number 1, a story so strange it set the tone for everything that followed. Our first case takes us back to the political heart of Washington, D.C. in the late 1990s, a place where security is supposed to be tighter than a drum. Yet, a young man named John J. Gutos managed to infiltrate this world with nothing more than sheer audacity and a stolen name. His target wasn't just anyone. He chose to impersonate a key staffer for one of the most powerful men in the country, Senator John McCain. Gutos didn't just use this identity to get a credit card. He used it to walk right into the inner sanctum of American power. The scheme began when Gutos somehow obtained the personal information of a legitimate young aide on Senator McCain's staff. With that data in hand, he didn't just make a fake ID, he went all in. He had business cards printed, established a phone line, and even set up an email address that mirrored the official Senate format. He then began calling various government agencies and political organizations, pretending to be the aide and requesting invitations to events, briefings, and most alarmingly, classified intelligence meetings. The most stunning part of this story is how successful he was. For weeks, this complete stranger attended high-level national security briefings at the Pentagon and the State Department. He rubbed shoulders with top military officials and intelligence analysts, all while posing as a representative of a United States senator. He was given access to sensitive documents and participated in discussions about matters of vital importance to the country's security. The security protocols in place designed to protect the nation's most guarded secrets were completely bypassed by a confident demeanor and a well-crafted lie. The entire facade came crashing down not through a high-tech security scan, but through simple human intuition. Staffers at a conservative think tank became suspicious. The man claiming to be a McCain aide just didn't seem to fit the part. His knowledge was superficial and his behavior was slightly off. They decided to do a little digging of their own and contacted the actual McCain office, only to discover the real aide was working elsewhere at that very moment. The web of deception unraveled instantly. Authorities were called and Gutos was arrested, bringing a swift end to one of the most brazen and dangerous acts of impersonation ever attempted on the American government. His actions exposed a terrifying vulnerability, proving that sometimes the most sophisticated locks are useless against a smooth talker with a convincing story. Just when you thought the audacity of impersonating a government official couldn't be topped, our next case plunges us into a world where the stakes were literally life and death. This story isn't about accessing secrets. It's about a teenager who, with little more than bravado and a forged piece of paper, walked into hospitals and was entrusted with human lives. We're talking about a high school student who decided his weekend job wouldn't be flipping burgers, it would be performing surgery. In the early 1990s, a young man named Michael Klein, not even old enough to vote, managed to convince multiple medical institutions across several states that he was a fully licensed, board-certified physician. His toolkit wasn't sophisticated. He essentially created a fake diploma from a prestigious medical school, fabricated a state medical license, and used his youthful confidence as his greatest asset. He wasn't lurking in the shadows. He was applying for jobs, interviewing, and getting hired into positions of immense responsibility in emergency rooms. The most chilling aspect of this story is the sheer breadth of medical duties he performed. This teenager, who should have been worrying about final exams and prom, was instead conducting physical examinations, suturing wounds, assisting in major surgeries, and prescribing powerful medications. He was making critical decisions that would impact patients' health for the rest of their lives, all without a single day of legitimate medical training. The systemic failures that allowed this to happen are staggering. Hospitals, seemingly desperate for staff, conducted shockingly lax background checks. They took his forged documents at face value, apparently more impressed with the name of a fake alma mater than with verifying his credentials with the actual licensing boards. Klein's deception eventually unraveled, not because a colleague grew suspicious of his medical skills, but due to a completely unrelated financial crime. He was caught writing bad checks, and during the subsequent investigation, his entire fabricated life as Dr. Michael Klein was exposed. The revelation sent shockwaves through the medical community and the general public alike. How could so many safeguards fail so spectacularly? This case became a terrifying lesson in the dangers of assumption and the critical importance of rigorous verification, especially in fields where a single mistake can have irreversible consequences. It proved that sometimes the costume of authority is just a convincing lie away. While a teenager performing surgery is a terrifying breach of trust, our next case involves a criminal whose sheer scale of deception is almost incomprehensible. Imagine not stealing one life but hundreds. This is the story of a woman who didn't just commit identity theft. She made it her entire existence, weaving a vast tapestry of lies so complex it took authorities years to untangle. Her name is Andrea Michelle Harris, though she answered to countless others, a master chameleon who perfected the art of becoming someone else. Operating primarily across the southern United States, Harris didn't just steal social security numbers, she built complete, believable personas from the ground up. Her method was a meticulous and patient-long game. She would first secure a legitimate birth certificate, often from a child who had died young, effectively resurrecting a real person on paper. With that foundational document, she could then apply for a driver's license, open bank accounts, and establish credit, all under this new, stolen name. She didn't just use these identities for quick cash grabs, she nurtured them. She would build up a credit score over months, sometimes years, patiently waiting until the line of credit was substantial enough to make a major hit worthwhile. Then she would max out every card, take out large loans she never intended to repay, and vanish, leaving a ruined credit history and a trail of confused victims in her wake. The psychological profile of such an individual is fascinating and disturbing. This isn't a crime of mere opportunity. It's a compulsion, a deeply ingrained need to escape oneself. Experts who have studied these prolific impostors suggest they often possess a form of sociopathy, lacking empathy for the financial and emotional ruin they leave behind. For them, each new identity is a fresh start, a game to be won. They thrive on the thrill of the deception itself, the satisfaction of outsmarting the system and everyone in it. Harris exhibited classic traits of a con artist: charismatic, highly intelligent, and profoundly manipulative, able to charm landlords, bankers, and even romantic partners into believing her ever-changing stories. The scale of her operation was staggering. By the time she was finally caught, investigators estimated she had assumed well over 100 identities and stolen millions of dollars. Her downfall came not from a digital trail, but from old-fashioned police work. A suspicious postal inspector in Texas noticed an unusual pattern of mail forwarding requests for multiple individuals, all leading to a single address. This small thread, once pulled, unraveled her entire network of fake lives, P.O. boxes, and storage units filled with the physical evidence of her cons: dozens of ID, credit cards, and checkbooks, each bearing a different name but all leading back to one woman. Her arrest closed one of the most extensive identity theft cases in history, a stark reminder that the most dangerous thieves are those who don't just want your money, but your entire life story. But just as a master con artist like Harris builds a web of lies to live, our next subject decided the only way to escape his crimes was to die. This is the bizarre tale of a man who, cornered by his own deceptions, staged one of the most final acts of deception imaginable: his own death. It's a story that begins with a trail of financial ruin and ends with a deserted boat, a cryptic note, and an investigation that had to prove a man was alive after he'd seemingly vanished from the face of the earth. The man at the center of this story was a serial fraudster, deeply entangled in a complex identity theft scheme that was on the verge of collapse. Facing imminent exposure and certain prison time, he concocted a desperate plan. He took his small sailboat out into the open waters off the coast of Alabama, deliberately scuttled it, and then set himself adrift in a life raft. He left behind a scene meticulously crafted for tragedy. Personal belongings were strewn about the deck, and a single, mournful note was left behind, suggesting a man who had chosen to end his own life rather than face the consequences of his actions. The Coast Guard launched a massive search and rescue operation, but after days of scouring the waves, they called off the search, presuming him lost at sea. His family mourned, and law enforcement closed their active files, believing their suspect was beyond the reach of any court. But this was not an ending, it was merely an intermission. The man hadn't perished in the cold waters of the Gulf. He had been picked up by an accomplice and smuggled ashore, where he immediately began the next phase of his plan, living a new life under a completely stolen identity. Using the personal information of a deceased child, he obtained a new birth certificate, a driver's license, and a social security number. He established a home, found work, and built a quiet, unassuming life, all while his previous identity was officially listed among the deceased. For a while, it seemed the perfect crime had been achieved. He had literally gotten away with everything. However, the very system he exploited to create his new life ultimately led to his downfall. The investigation was reopened years later due to a persistent insurance investigator who found the circumstances of the death at sea just a little too convenient. The break in the case came from a painstaking analysis of financial and digital records. Even though he was careful, traces of his new life began to connect back to his old one. A small inheritance, a forgotten bank account, or a digital footprint, something always remains. Investigators discovered that the identity he had assumed belonged to a person who had died in infancy decades prior, a classic red flag for fraud. They then tracked his movements, piecing together a timeline that proved he had been alive and well long after his supposed demise. The man who had so convincingly played dead was finally arrested, forced to confront a justice he had tried so theatrically to escape. His case stands as a stark reminder that in the digital age, no one truly disappears, and that faking your death might be the easiest part of the crime compared to staying hidden forever. While faking one's own death is a dramatic way to vanish, identity thieves often find an even darker and more readily available resource: the identities of those who are already gone. This next case is a profoundly unsettling look into a common yet deeply invasive form of fraud, where criminals don't just steal a life, they rob the dead. Our focus turns to a specific man who didn't just use a stolen social security number for a quick loan. He used one to construct an entire existence over the course of decades, all built upon the most fragile and innocent of foundations: a deceased child. The target was a baby boy who lived for only a few short months in the 1940s before tragically passing away. In an era long before digital records and identity protection services, his death was recorded on paper, and his social security number fell into silence, essentially becoming a dormant number in the vast government system. Decades later, a man we'll refer to as Robert, though that was never his real name, somehow discovered this inactive number. He saw it not as a marker of a lost life, but as a perfect, clean slate. Unlike the identity of a living adult, a deceased child's social security number carries no history, no credit report, and no risk of the legitimate owner noticing strange activity. For a fraudster, it is a blank check to write an entirely new life story, and write a new life is exactly what Robert did. He obtained a copy of the infant's birth certificate, and with that, he was able to secure a legitimate driver's license and a social security card bearing his own face but the baby's name and number. This wasn't a short-term alias, this became who he was. He used this stolen identity to get a job, pay taxes, and even get married. He raised a family, bought a home, and built a seemingly normal, upstanding life in his community. For all intents and purposes, he was a law-abiding citizen, a taxpayer, a family man. His colleagues, his friends, even his own children knew him only by this stolen name. The sheer longevity of the deception is what makes it so extraordinary. This wasn't a crime that lasted for weeks or months. It was a performance he maintained for over 30 years. The emotional impact of such a discovery is almost impossible to quantify. Imagine being a relative of that infant, perhaps an older sibling who only knew of the brother they lost so long ago. Then, decades later, you receive a call from an investigator asking if you know why your deceased brother's social security number is active and attached to a man in another state. The grief from a childhood tragedy is suddenly and violently reopened, compounded by the bizarre violation of having a stranger inhabit your lost sibling's identity. For Robert's own family, the revelation was equally devastating. The man they knew as a husband and father was suddenly a phantom. Their entire history, the very foundation of their family, was built on a lie. Their name, their legal documents, their sense of reality, all of it was called into question in an instant. So how does a deception this deep and enduring finally unravel? The catalyst is often something entirely mundane. In many cases, it's a simple background check or a routine audit by the Social Security Administration that flags an anomaly. A number assigned to someone born in the 1940s shouldn't belong to a man who appears to be in his 50s. The system, though slow, eventually catches these inconsistencies. For Robert, the specific trigger was likely a cross-referencing of data between the Social Security Administration's Death Master file and active tax records. Once the mismatch was identified, investigators began to peel back the layers of his constructed life, leading to his arrest for identity theft and fraud. His case is a haunting example of how the past is never truly buried, and how the most successful lies are often the ones that look, from the outside, exactly like a normal, quiet life. If the idea of a lone teenager in an operating room sends a chill down your spine, consider the implications of an unauthorized individual penetrating the very agency tasked with stopping such crimes. Our next story is perhaps one of the most audacious in the annals of American impersonation. A tale not of stealing an identity for profit, but for power, prestige, and access to the nation's most sensitive law enforcement secrets. This is the case of a man who didn't just pretend to be a police officer for a day. He successfully posed as a Federal Bureau of Investigation agent for years, embedding himself into the heart of the Bureau's culture and operations. The impostor, a man named Matthew Robert Brown, didn't rely on a stolen identity from a specific agent. Instead, he constructed the persona of an FBI agent from whole cloth, using a combination of forged credentials, a fabricated backstory, and an actor's confidence. He acquired realistic-looking badges and credentials, perhaps from overseas counterfeit operations or online black markets. But his most powerful tool was his deep knowledge of FBI jargon, procedures, and internal culture, which he reportedly gleaned from years of studying true crime books, television shows, and publicly available documentaries. He didn't just look the part, he spoke the part with unnerving authenticity, discussing cases and protocols with a familiarity that disarmed even seasoned professionals. This deep cover allowed him to achieve the unthinkable. Brown didn't just hang around the periphery, he actively infiltrated FBI field operations. He attended official law enforcement conferences and training seminars, mingling with real agents and sometimes even offering unsolicited advice on ongoing cases. He managed to gain access to restricted areas within federal buildings, flashing his fake badge to bypass security checkpoints. In one of his most brazen acts, he allegedly inserted himself into a legitimate, high-stakes undercover operation, approaching the actual target and identifying himself as the lead agent, potentially jeopardizing months of meticulous investigative work. The sheer gall of walking into the lion's den and giving the lion's orders is a level of audacity that is difficult to comprehend. So how could such an elaborate ruse persist for so long under the nose of the world's premier law enforcement agency? The security lapses that enabled this are a complex mix of human psychology and systemic trust. The FBI, like many powerful institutions, operates on a foundation of assumed trust. When someone displays the right credentials, uses the correct terminology, and carries themselves with unwavering authority, the natural human inclination is to believe them. Challenging a fellow agent requires overcoming a deep-seated professional courtesy and a reluctance to appear foolish or paranoid for questioning a colleague. Furthermore, the impostor exploited the bureaucratic and siloed nature of large organizations. An agent from a hypothetical, off-site cyber division wouldn't be known to everyone, giving Brown a convenient backstory to explain why he wasn't a familiar face in the local field office. The house of cards finally began to collapse not from a failure of his performance, but from the very thing that often unravels great deceptions: greed and overreach. Brown's motive evolved from the thrill of the con to financial gain. He began using his fabricated status to defraud individuals and businesses, shaking them down for money or favors by threatening them with fictitious federal investigations. This brought his activities to the attention of people outside the FBI's circle of trust, individuals who had no reason to assume his legitimacy and every reason to be suspicious of his demands. These victims reported the encounters to the real FBI, prompting an internal investigation that quickly revealed there was no special agent Matthew Brown on the payroll. The man who had spent years living in their world was arrested by the very colleagues he had duped, his performance ending not with a standing ovation but with the cold click of handcuffs. His story remains a masterclass in social engineering and a permanent cautionary tale about the vulnerabilities that exist even in the most secure fortresses, vulnerabilities built not on weak locks but on inherent human trust. Yet the audacity of posing as an FBI agent pales in comparison to a deception that strikes at the very core of human trust and intimacy. Our next case delves into the world of romance fraud, but with a sinister twist that goes far beyond a lonely heart scam. This is the story of a con artist who didn't just steal identities to open credit cards. He used them to open hearts, weaving a web of bigamy and financial ruin that left a trail of emotionally shattered lives in his wake. His weapon of choice wasn't a forged badge, but a forged marriage certificate. The individual at the center of this story, whom we'll call David for clarity, was a master of the long con. His scheme was chillingly systematic. He would first assume a stolen identity, often that of a successful professional, a doctor, a lawyer, or a businessman, to present himself as an unstable, desirable partner. Using online dating sites and social media, he would seek out intelligent, successful women who are perhaps feeling a bit disillusioned with the dating scene and yearning for a genuine connection. He was a virtuoso of love bombing, showering his targets with attention, affection, and promises of a shared future. He spoke of marriage, children, and building a life together with a conviction that felt utterly real to his victims. Once he had secured their trust and affection, the financial manipulation would begin. It always started with a plausible crisis. His medical practice was facing a sudden lawsuit, and he needed temporary funds to cover legal fees. Or a lucrative business deal was about to close, but he needed a short-term loan to cover a final investment. The amounts would start small, just enough to test their willingness to help, and then they would grow exponentially. He would provide fake documents, have accomplices pose as his lawyer or business partner on the phone, and create an entire narrative of urgency and temporary misfortune. Because his victims were in love and saw a future with him, they often mortgaged their homes, drained their retirement savings, and took out massive loans in their own names to help the man they believed was their fiancé. The most devastating layer of this fraud was the bigamy. David wasn't content with defrauding one woman at a time. He would maintain several of these fraudulent relationships simultaneously, sometimes even marrying multiple women in different states using his various stolen identities. He managed this elaborate juggling act with meticulous planning, using the excuse of constant business travel to explain his absences. He would have separate phones for each victim, carefully curated social media profiles, and a calendar that would make a CEO dizzy. The emotional impact on the victims when the truth was uncovered is almost too profound to articulate. It wasn't just the financial devastation, though that was catastrophic enough. It was the complete annihilation of their reality, the loving, devoted partner they thought they knew never existed. The future they had dreamed of was a fiction. They were left not only bankrupt but heartbroken, grappling with a deep sense of shame and betrayal that left lasting psychological scars. Their trust in others and in their own judgment was often destroyed. David's downfall came from the very modern tool he used to ensnare his victims, the internet. One of his wives, growing suspicious of his constant trips and secretive phone behavior, decided to do a reverse image search on one of his profile pictures. To her horror, the image was linked to a news article about a convicted con artist from another state. She reached out to the other woman named in the article, and together they began to connect the dots, eventually finding a small network of other victims online. They pooled their information, shared stories, and compiled a dossier of evidence that they presented to authorities. This case highlights a terrifying evolution in identity theft, where the stolen commodity isn't just a credit line, but a person's capacity for love and trust, exploited with a cruelty that is almost unimaginable. This case delves into a betrayal so intimate it challenges our very understanding of family loyalty. We now examine the story of a pair of identical twins, two individuals who shared not only the same DNA but the same face from birth. For one brother, that genetic mirror became a weapon to systematically destroy the other's life. This isn't a story of a stranger stealing a social security number from the dark web. It's a story of a brother looking into his own reflection and deciding to become the man he saw. The scheme relied on their physical sameness, a perfect biological loophole that bypassed even the most stringent forms of identification. When asked for a photo ID, they were identical. When facial recognition software was used, it saw the same person. The fraudulent twin exploited this inherent trust, methodically gathering his brother's personal information over the years: his social security number, his mother's maiden name, the details of his first car. He then used this knowledge to open credit card accounts, take out auto loans, and secure lines of credit, all in his brother's name. The bills would go to a separate post office box he controlled, so the legitimate twin remained blissfully unaware as his financial reputation was being methodically dismantled. The emotional devastation here is multifaceted. Beyond the financial ruin and the endless hours spent disputing fraudulent charges, the victim had to grapple with a profound sense of violation. His closest relative, the person who had shared a womb with him, had looked at his life and seen nothing more than an opportunity to be plundered. The psychological damage from such a familial betrayal often runs deeper and lasts far longer than any monetary loss. The legal complexities that emerged from this case were a nightmare for the judicial system. How do you prosecute a crime where the prime suspect is a perfect physical match for the victim? Establishing intent and proving which twin was actually present at the time of each fraudulent transaction became a prosecutor's greatest challenge. The defense could simply argue that it was a case of mistaken identity, that the accused twin was actually the victim himself. This forced investigators to rely on digital forensics and meticulous paper trails, cell phone records placing the fraudulent twin near the bank at the exact time a loan was taken out, security camera footage from inside the bank that might capture a small, distinguishing tattoo normally hidden under a sleeve, or even differences in their signatures that a handwriting expert could identify. The case became a landmark example of how the legal system must adapt to confront crimes made possible by our own biology, proving that even the most perfect alibi can be undone by the smallest digital footprint. While the betrayal by a twin is a uniquely personal violation, our next case takes identity theft to the glittering, glamorous world of Hollywood, where one man decided that if he couldn't achieve fame, he would simply steal it. This is the story of an impersonator who didn't just want to look like a celebrity. He wanted to live the entire life of one, using a famous name as his passport to a world of luxury, adoration, and unearned privilege. The mark was a well-known, but not overwhelmingly a list character actor, someone recognizable enough to open doors, but not so famous that his every move was tracked by the paparazzi. This careful selection was key. The impostor, a man named James, possessed a passing resemblance to the actor, which he enhanced with a similar haircut, studied mannerisms, and the confidence of someone who believed he deserved the life he was stealing. His fraud wasn't a simple case of telling a few fans he was the actor for free drinks at a bar. This was a full-scale, meticulously planned operation to inhabit the celebrity's identity for financial and social gain. His methods were a masterclass in modern grift. He began by creating flawless fake credentials, a driver's license, a SAG after union card, and even fabricated call sheets and contracts from major studios to bolster his story. He then leveraged the power of social media, creating verified-looking accounts in the actor's name to add a layer of digital legitimacy. With this foundation, he began to exploit the inherent deference that luxury industries show to the famous. He would call five-star hotels in advance of filming on location, using the name of a real producer or director he had researched to book lavish suites under the actor's name, promising payment upon arrival. He would then show up, often greeted by star-struck staff, and use a combination of charm and forged documents to check in. He dined at the finest restaurants, where managers would comp his meals for the honor of his presence, and he gained backstage access to concerts and exclusive events by name dropping and flashing his fake ID. The financial fraud was even more audacious. Using the actor's personal details, which he had likely gleaned from a data broker or a previous security breach, he applied for and received high-limit credit cards. He took out substantial loans from private lenders who were all too eager to lend money to a seemingly successful Hollywood star, accepting his fabricated pay stubs and film contracts as collateral. He leased luxury cars and even rented a stunning home in the Hollywood Hills, all under the actor's name and social security number. For months, he lived a millionaire's lifestyle, leaving a trail of bewildered merchants and massive unpaid debts behind him. The unraveling of this glamorous fraud came from two directions. First, the real actor began to receive baffling calls from collection agencies about debts he never incurred. Second, and perhaps more decisively, the impostor's ambition finally outstripped his caution. He attempted to use one of his fraudulently obtained credit cards at an extremely high-end boutique whose owner happened to be a personal friend of the actual actor. A quick phone call to his friend revealed the actor was on location in Europe, making his presence in this Los Angeles store an impossibility. Security was called and the police were notified. The subsequent investigation peeled back the layers of his entire operation, revealing a web of deceit built on vanity, opportunity, and a deep desire for a life he had not earned. His case serves as a stark reminder that in our culture of celebrity worship, fame itself can be the most valuable and most vulnerable asset of all. While a stolen identity can buy a life of luxury or grant access to government secrets, perhaps the most intellectually arrogant form of this crime is using a stolen name to pose as an expert and shape young minds. Our 10th case takes us onto the supposedly hallowed grounds of higher education, where a man with no academic credentials whatsoever successfully impersonated a college professor for an entire semester, teaching classes, grading papers, and advising students, all under the guise of a scholar he had never met. The impostor, a man in his late 20s, managed to secure a visiting lecturer position at a small liberal arts college. He had assumed the identity of a real academic, whose resume boasted a PhD from a prestigious university and a list of published papers. The fraudster had somehow obtained copies of the legitimate professor's transcripts and dissertation, allowing him to craft a convincing backstory. He aced the initial phone interview, his confidence and studied use of academic jargon masking his complete lack of genuine knowledge. When he arrived on campus, he carried with him forged letters of recommendation and a fabricated faculty ID, completing the illusion. His performance in the classroom was a masterclass in bluffing. He assigned dense reading materials he himself likely barely understood, relying on the textbook's introductory chapters and online summaries to stay one step ahead of his students. Class discussions were steered away from deep, technical analysis and toward broad, philosophical debates where his natural charisma and verbal agility could shine. When a student asked a complex, specific question he couldn't answer, he would deflect with a practiced technique, saying something like, "That's an excellent question and gets to the very heart of the matter. Why don't you research that and present your findings to the class next week?" This tactic not only bought him time but also made the student feel valued, all while covering for his own ignorance. The reaction of his students upon the discovery of the fraud was a complex mix of shock, betrayal, and a strange sense of retrospective clarity. Many reported feeling that something was subtly off. His grading seemed arbitrary. His office hours were always abruptly cut short, and his explanations sometimes circled back without ever landing on a solid point. Yet, in an environment where students are conditioned to respect authority and assume their professors are infallible experts, they dismissed their own suspicions. The revelation that their trusted teacher was a complete fraud forced them to question their own judgment and the very integrity of the institution they attended. Their academic credits for that semester were thrown into question, and the entire experience was tainted by the deception. The college administration and his faculty colleagues were utterly humiliated. Their background check process, which relied heavily on verifying documents provided by the candidate rather than independently contacting institutions, had failed catastrophically. The scandal exposed a dangerous complacency within academia, an assumption that anyone who sounds like a professor and looks the part must be one. The breach of trust extended beyond the classroom, This imposter had attended faculty meetings, participated in curriculum planning, and had access to private student information and university resources. His unmasking, which eventually came from a diligent department secretary who grew suspicious after noticing discrepancies in his listed graduation dates, caused an institutional crisis that led to a complete overhaul of their hiring protocols. This case stands as a stark warning that expertise cannot be taken at face value, and that the most valuable thing a university offers, its credibility, can be stolen just as easily as a credit card number. While the academic imposter traded on the illusion of expertise, our next case reveals a criminal whose motive was far more primal and materialistic, pure, unadulterated greed. This is the story of a woman who saw identity theft not as a means to escape her own life, but as a direct funding mechanism for a lifestyle so lavish it would make a sultan blush. Her name is Sana El-Hendi, and she orchestrated one of the most brazen and extravagant spending sprees in the history of financial fraud, leaving a vapor trail of maxed-out credit and broken trust across the country. El-Hendi's method was a ruthless numbers game. She didn't just assume one or two identities, she operated a veritable factory of fraud, systematically harvesting the personal information of dozens, if not hundreds, of individuals. She obtained this data through a variety of means, from phishing scams and hacking into corporate databases to the simpler, more intimate method of stealing mail and digging through trash. With each new set of social security numbers, dates of birth, and addresses, she saw not a person but a potential credit line. Her first step was always to build the identity, applying for pre-approved credit cards with small initial limits. She would make small, timely payments for a few months to increase the spending limit, carefully nurturing the stolen credit profile like a gardener tending a poisonous plant, waiting for it to bear its most lucrative fruit. Once the credit limits were sufficiently high, the spending began, and it wasn't just spending, it was a full-scale assault on every luxury good and experience imaginable. El-Hendi leased a fleet of high-end vehicles, including a Mercedes-Benz and a BMW, all under her various stolen names. She booked first-class flights to destinations like Paris, Dubai, and Bali, staying in 5-star suites and charging every exquisite meal and spa treatment to her fraudulent cards. Her shopping sprees were the stuff of legend, filling storage units with designer clothing, handbags from Louis Vuitton and Hermes, and expensive jewelry. She didn't just buy a watch, she bought a Rolex. She didn't just rent an apartment, she leased a penthouse with a view, using a falsified rental application and pay stubs. The sheer volume of her theft was matched only by the audacity of her taste. The emotional and financial wreckage she left in her wake was catastrophic. For her victims, the discovery was often slow and confusing. They would start receiving calls from collection agencies for debts they knew nothing about. Their credit scores, which they had spent a lifetime building, were suddenly in ruins, making it impossible to buy a car, secure a mortgage, or even sometimes get a job. The process of clearing their names was a bureaucratic nightmare, often taking years of frustrating phone calls, sworn affidavits, and countless hours of their time. For many, the violation felt deeply personal. It wasn't just about the money, it was the knowledge that a stranger had been living it up, enjoying a life of decadent pleasure funded by their good name and financial reputation. The injustice was a bitter pill to swallow. El-Hendi's downfall was ironically precipitated by the very thing she coveted most, luxury. Her extravagant lifestyle made her complacent. She began to make mistakes, using the same shipping address for items purchased under different names, or getting sloppy with the details on her fake ID. A sharp-eyed luxury car dealership manager grew suspicious when a woman claiming to be a high-powered executive with a pristine credit history seemed oddly unfamiliar with the basic features of the expensive car she was trying to lease. The manager discreetly ran a more thorough check, found inconsistencies, and alerted the authorities. investigators from the Postal Inspection Service and the FBI were able to follow the digital and paper trail, piecing together her entire operation from the mountain of receipts, flight manifests, and bank statements. Her arrest closed the book on a spree of theft that was as breathtaking in its scope as it was devastating in its impact. A stark lesson in how the relentless pursuit of a luxurious life can ultimately lead to the most Spartan of existences, a prison cell. It's a terrifying thought that the very person sworn to protect your identity might be the one plotting to steal it. Our next case plunges us into a world of profound irony and betrayal, where the badge meant to symbolize justice was used as a master key to unlock the private lives of countless citizens. This is the story of an identity thief who didn't just evade the law, he was the law, using the power and access of his position as a police officer to carry out his crimes with impunity. The individual at the center of this scheme was a patrol officer in a medium-sized city, a man his colleagues knew as a dedicated, if somewhat quiet, public servant. To the outside world, he was the picture of reliability, the kind of officer you'd trust to help you in a moment of crisis. But behind that uniform was a criminal who saw every traffic stop, every routine call for service, and every access to the law enforcement database not as a duty, but as a golden opportunity. His method was chillingly straightforward. While on duty, he would run the license plates and driver's licenses of ordinary citizens through the National Crime Information Center database and other state systems, compiling a private list of names, dates of birth, and social security numbers. He specifically targeted individuals who shared a similar age and general description to himself, making the stolen identities easier to leverage later. With this treasure trove of personal data acquired under the color of authority, he would then embark on a campaign of financial fraud. He used the information to open credit card accounts, apply for personal loans, and even file fraudulent tax returns to claim refunds. The most brazen aspect of his operation was the layer of protection his job provided. If a bank or credit agency grew suspicious and tried to verify information, who would they believe? A nervous fraud investigator or a confident police officer who could authoritatively confirm the details over the phone, even using his official police email address to add credibility to his schemes. His position granted him an unparalleled shield of legitimacy, allowing him to bypass security questions and verification processes that would have stopped a common criminal in their tracks. The impact of this breach of trust extended far beyond the financial losses for his victims. Each person targeted had their most sensitive information compromised by someone they were taught to trust implicitly. The violation carried an extra layer of psychological trauma, knowing that a guardian of public safety had instead become a predator. For the police department itself, the scandal was a catastrophic blow to its credibility. It forced an agonizing internal investigation and a complete overhaul of database access protocols, highlighting a terrifying vulnerability. Systems designed to catch criminals were, in this case, being weaponized by one. The officer's eventual downfall came not from external audit, but from his own growing greed. He became sloppy, applying for too many lines of credit in a short period from the same computer, which triggered a fraud alert that even his badge couldn't explain away. An investigation by the state's Attorney General's office, working in conjunction with Internal Affairs, painstakingly connected the digital dots back to his patrol car's computer and his home internet connection, leading to his arrest and a stunning fall from grace that served as a grim reminder that sometimes the greatest threats don't wear masks, they wear uniforms. The turmoil of the Vietnam War era created a powerful and desperate incentive for evasion, giving rise to a very specific and morally complex form of identity theft. While some burned draft cards or fled to Canada, others chose a more clandestine and permanent method of escape. They simply became someone else. This case examines the story of one such individual, a man who didn't just dodge the draft. he erased his own existence and adopted the life of a deceased child to avoid being sent to a conflict he wanted no part of. The subject, whom we'll call Robert Miller, was a young man facing the very real prospect of being drafted in the late 1960s. Like many of his generation, he was terrified by the news reports coming out of Southeast Asia and was deeply opposed to the war. The pressure of the looming draft lottery, which literally used birth dates to determine fate, created an atmosphere of palpable anxiety. For Miller, the fear was overwhelming, and the idea of leaving his life behind to potentially lose it in a jungle thousands of miles away pushed him toward a drastic and irreversible decision. His motivation wasn't greed or a desire for a better life. It was primal survival, a desperate attempt to control a destiny that felt like it was being snatched away by forces beyond his control. His method was both macabre and ingenious. Through means that were unfortunately all too common at the time, he obtained the birth certificate of a young boy who had died in a car accident years earlier. In an era before sophisticated digital record-keeping, the social security number of a deceased child often remained dormant, a ghost in the system just waiting to be reanimated. Miller applied for a duplicate social security card using the child's birth certificate, effectively legally resurrecting the deceased boy. With these two foundational documents, the rest of the bureaucratic world opened up to him. He obtained a driver's license, got a job, and began paying taxes, all under his new, stolen name. He didn't just avoid the draft, he vanished from the system entirely as far as the Selective Service was concerned. The original Robert Miller had simply disappeared. The long-term consequences of this choice were a tangled web of isolation and constant anxiety. While he had escaped the immediate threat of Vietnam, he had condemned himself to a life of looking over his shoulder. Every interaction with authority, from a routine traffic stop to a job application, carried the risk of exposure. Forming deep, meaningful relationships was nearly impossible because it required building them on a foundation of lies. He could never truly share his past or his fears with anyone. He was trapped in the identity he had created, a prisoner of the very freedom he had sought. The psychological toll of living a double life for decades is incalculable, a slow erosion of self that likely left him wondering who he really was. The impact of this deception also rippled outwards, causing collateral damage to the family of the deceased child. Imagine the shock and pain for the parents of that young boy, who had already endured the unimaginable tragedy of losing a son, only to discover years later that his identity had been stolen. A letter from the IRS questioning tax filings under their deceased child's name, or a call from a credit agency, would have violently reopened old wounds, adding a bizarre and painful layer of violation to their grief. Their son's memory was no longer their own. It had been hijacked and commodified by a stranger. Miller's story eventually came to light decades later, not through a dramatic arrest, but through the slow, inexorable march of technological progress. As government databases became digitized and linked, anomalies that were once hidden in paper files began to surface. A routine cross-check between the Social Security Administration's death records and active tax filings would have flagged his identity as a mismatch. A simple investigation revealed that the person using that Social Security number was decades older than the person to whom it was issued should have been. For Miller, the consequences of his decades-old crime were ironically less severe than the war he feared. He likely faced charges of identity theft and fraud, but by then he was an old man, and the courts often looked upon these draft evasion cases with a complex mix of legal obligation and historical understanding. His case remains a poignant relic of a deeply divisive time in American history, a testament to the extreme lengths a person will go to when they feel they have no other choice. Moving from the desperate measures of draft dodgers to a scheme of pure fantastical ambition, our next case is perhaps the most creatively audacious on our list. This is the story of a man who saw identity theft not as a means to an end, but as the foundational tool for building his very own empire. He didn't just want to be someone else, he wanted to rule over a nation of his own creation, using a web of stolen identities to staff his government, fund his treasury, and legitimize his delusions of grandeur. The mastermind behind this operation was a man named James Austin Grote III, though he would become better known by his royal title, King James of the so-called Dominion of Melchizedek. In the late 1980s, Grote and a small group of collaborators laid claim to a series of uninhabited, and in some cases entirely non-existent, islands in the Pacific. One of their primary territories was a tiny, barren atoll also claimed by France, while another was a fictional island he simply drew on a map. With no land, no people, and no recognition from any legitimate government on Earth, Melchizedek was a nation in name only. But for Grote, that was merely a detail to be overcome through sheer force of forgery and fraud. This is where identity theft became his primary statecraft. To make his micronation appear real, he needed citizens, government officials, and a paper trail. Grote and his associates began harvesting the identities of real people, often targeting the vulnerable and the deceased. They would appoint unsuspecting individuals as ambassadors, ministers of finance, or citizens without their knowledge or consent, using their stolen personal information to create official-looking Melchizedek passports, diplomatic credentials, and government identification cards. These documents were then used as instruments of high-level fraud. The con artists would approach international banks, presenting their beautifully forged Melchizedek diplomatic papers to open accounts for their fake nation's central bank. They sold phony Melchizedek banking licenses to financial institutions in unstable parts of the world, offering a veil of legitimacy for a hefty fee. Most brazenly, they used these fake diplomatic passports to travel the world, enjoying diplomatic immunity that they had entirely invented. The scheme's impact was far more real than the country it purported to represent. A number of individuals found themselves unknowingly listed as high-ranking officials of a nation they had never heard of, leading to bewildering interactions with actual law enforcement and immigration authorities. Financial institutions, particularly in Asia and the Pacific, were swindled out of millions of dollars by investing in the Dominion's fraudulent banking schemes and bonds. The Micronesian government of the Marshall Islands was forced to issue a public warning against Melchizedek after con artists tried to use its documents to fraudulently claim land there. For years, Grote operated with impunity, exploiting the gray areas of international law and the simple fact that his claims were so outlandish that they often flew under the radar of serious investigators. The unraveling of this fictional kingdom was as complex as its creation. The persistent efforts of international journalists and skeptics who tirelessly documented the fraud and warned governments around the world played a key role. The internet eventually became both his tool and his downfall. While he used it to spread propaganda about his nation, it also allowed investigators and victims to connect and share information, slowly stripping away the layers of deception. Pressure from Interpol and the United States government finally led to arrests and indictments. Grote himself was eventually convicted on multiple counts of fraud, though he never truly abandoned his royal pretensions. The case of the Dominion of Melchizedek remains a breathtaking example of how a confident lie, backed by expertly forged documents built on a foundation of stolen identities, can briefly convince the world that a complete fiction is real. It proves that the most effective cons aren't always about hiding in the shadows. Sometimes they're about building a castle in the sky and daring everyone to look up. If you thought stealing a celebrity's identity was risky or a police officer's was ironic, consider the sheer, breathtaking danger of stealing the identity of someone the government has gone to extraordinary lengths to make disappear. This next case plunges us into the shadowy, high-stakes world of the Federal Witness Protection Program, where a stolen identity isn't just a path to financial gain. it's a potential death warrant and a direct threat to national security. The program, officially known as the Witness Security Program or WITSEC, is designed to give new lives to individuals who have risked everything to testify against dangerous criminals, from mob bosses to drug cartel kingpins. Their safety relies on one sacred principle: absolute secrecy. Their old identities are scrubbed from existence, and new ones are meticulously constructed in a process so secretive that even most government officials are kept in the dark. To compromise, that is, to undo one of the Justice Department's most vital tools, the individual responsible for this catastrophic breach saw this not as a line that should never be crossed, but as the ultimate opportunity. The identity of a protected witness is the holy grail for a certain kind of identity thief. It is, by design, pristine. It has a clean credit history, a verifiable backstory created by government experts, and supporting documentation that is, for all intents and purposes, entirely legitimate because it is legitimate, issued by the very authorities who would normally be investigating fraud. For a criminal, it's a perfect, unblemished shield. The method of obtaining such an identity is horrifying in its simplicity: corruption or a catastrophic security failure. In this case, it was likely a low-level government clerk or a private contractor with access to the sensitive database where these new identities are managed. For a bribe, or perhaps through a digital hack, the thief obtained the complete identity package of a witness who had testified against a major organized crime family. The immediate consequences were twofold and devastating. First, and most dire, was the imminent physical danger to the witness and their family. The entire purpose of their new life was instantly nullified. The criminal organization that had wanted them dead now had a new name, a new address, and a new life to target. The safety net woven by the U.S. Marshals Service, which involves around-the-clock protection and constant relocation, was torn apart by a single act of greed. The witness, who had likely endured unimaginable stress to do the right thing, was now exposed because someone saw their carefully constructed new life as a commodity to be sold. The psychological terror of that betrayal is impossible to overstate. The feeling that the very government that promised you safety can't even protect your most basic information. Second, the breach represented a monumental threat to national security and the entire justice system. The Witness Protection Program is a cornerstone of the government's ability to prosecute high-level organized crime and terrorism. Its effectiveness relies entirely on the promise of anonymity. If witnesses cannot trust that the program will keep them safe, they will simply stop coming forward. Without insider testimony, prosecuting the most powerful and dangerous criminal enterprises becomes nearly impossible. This single act of identity theft didn't just endanger one life, it risked dismantling a key instrument of American jurisprudence, sending a chilling message to every potential future witness that the system could not be trusted. The investigation that followed was undoubtedly one of the most intense and urgent ever launched by the U.S. Marshals Service, the agency tasked with protecting these individuals. This wasn't a routine financial fraud case. It was a race against time to find the leaker and contain the damage before a murder could take place. The response would have been immediate and drastic. The exposed witness and their family were likely whisked away to a secure location within hours of the discovery, beginning the painstaking process of building yet another new identity from scratch. Meanwhile, digital forensic investigators worked backwards from the stolen identities, misuse perhaps to open a credit card or secure a loan, to trace the transaction back to the impostor and from there back to the original source of the leak. The culprit, once identified, would have faced not just charges of identity theft and fraud, but likely additional federal charges of compromising national security and witness tampering, carrying sentences that would ensure they were never in a position to betray such a trust again. This case stands as the ultimate example of identity theft's potential for harm, proving that the theft of a name can carry consequences far heavier than any stolen sum of money. While the previous cases showcased thieves targeting celebrities or witnesses for money or power, the motives in our next story are far more disturbing and directly dangerous to public health. This is the case of an identity thief who didn't just want to live a lavish life. They wanted access to the tools of healing, turning hospitals and pharmacies into their personal playground with potentially lethal consequences. This criminal had a very specific type of victim in mind: medical professionals, and their scheme created a ripple effect of risk that extended far beyond financial ruin. The individual at the center of this operation understood that a doctor or nurse's credentials were a master key to a world of controlled substances and expensive medical technology. Their method was a calculated and chillingly efficient process. They would first identify their targets, often surgeons, anesthesiologists, or emergency room physicians professionals whose credentials would grant them the highest level of access with the least amount of immediate scrutiny. Using a combination of phishing scams, database hacks, or even old-fashioned dumpster diving near medical offices, they would gather the necessary personal information: medical license numbers, DEA registration numbers for prescribing controlled substances, and social security numbers. With this data in hand, the imposter would then forge physical identification badges and official-looking documentation, but the real damage was done digitally. They would infiltrate hospital prescribing systems or pharmacy networks, using the stolen DEA numbers to place orders for massive quantities of powerful opioids like oxycodone, fentanyl patches, or stimulants. These drugs weren't for personal use, they were for resale on the black market, where prescription painkillers can fetch a higher price than street drugs. In other instances, the thief would use the stolen identity to gain temporary employment at a hospital or clinic, not to earn a paycheck, but to have direct physical access to the drug cabinets and storage rooms, allowing them to steal pharmaceuticals and even small, expensive medical devices directly. The public health implications of this kind of fraud are terrifyingly profound. First, there is the direct risk of diverted pharmaceuticals ending up on the street, fueling the very opioid epidemic that public health officials are desperately trying to combat. Each pill illegally obtained through this method is a potential overdose waiting to happen. Second, and just as alarming, is the risk to patient safety. If an imposter successfully gains employment using a stolen identity, they are placed in a position of immense responsibility without any of the requisite training. This isn't just a teenager bluffing his way through a lecture. This is an untrained individual potentially making life or death decisions, administering medications, or assisting in procedures they know nothing about. The potential for a catastrophic medical error is astronomical. For the medical professionals whose identities were stolen, the fallout was a professional and personal nightmare. A doctor might suddenly find their DEA number flagged for suspicious activity, suspending their ability to prescribe necessary medications for their legitimate patients. Their hard-earned reputation, built over decades of rigorous study and careful practice, could be tarnished in an instant by accusations of drug diversion or fraud. They faced lengthy investigations from state medical boards, the Drug Enforcement Administration, and their own hospital administrations, a process that could halt their career and cause immense emotional distress. Clearing their name required navigating a bureaucratic labyrinth to prove they were victims, not perpetrators, all while worrying about the harm being done to real patients in their name. This particular brand of identity thief was ultimately caught not through a financial audit, but through the vigilant eyes of fellow medical staff. A pharmacist might become suspicious of an irregular prescribing pattern for a doctor who normally only writes for small amounts of a specific drug. A hospital HR employee might notice a discrepancy on a fraudulent application, such as a listed medical school that the real doctor never attended. These small cracks in the facade, noticed by professionals who understand the stakes, often lead to the scheme's collapse. The subsequent investigation, involving the DA's Diversion Control Division and local law enforcement, would work backwards from the digital or physical evidence to uncover the entire operation. This case serves as a stark reminder that in the hands of the wrong person, the tools of healing can become instruments of profit and peril, and that the theft of a healer's identity is an attack on the very foundation of public trust in our healthcare system. But perhaps the most intimate and painful betrayal occurs not between strangers, but within the supposed sanctuary of the family itself. Our next case isn't about a master con artist or a desperate draft dodger. It's about the familiar dynamics of a parent and child, twisted into something dark and opportunistic. This is the story of a son who looked at his own father not as a patriarch to be respected, but as a financial resource to be plundered, using the very trust inherent in their relationship as the perfect cover for his crimes. The setup for this kind of familial identity theft is deceptively simple and heartbreakingly common. A son, often in his late 20s or early 30s, is facing financial difficulties. Perhaps he has mounting credit card debt, a failing business, or simply a lifestyle he can't afford to maintain. Instead of turning to his parents for a loan or for advice, he sees a far easier solution. He already has access to a treasure trove of his father's personal information. He may have lived at home, helped with taxes, or simply known the answers to common security questions his whole life. The mother's maiden name, he knew it. The father's date of birth and social security number, he'd seen them on 100 forms. The barrier to entry was non-existent. The trust was already there. The method of the theft was a slow, insidious process that mirrored the trust it exploited. He didn't launch a full-scale attack all at once. He started small, perhaps applying for a single credit card in his father's name, using the family home address but having the statement sent to a new email account or a P.O. box he controlled. When the small charges went unnoticed, his confidence grew. He began to escalate, applying for store credit cards at high-end electronics retailers or furniture stores to fund his lifestyle. The pinnacle of his fraud was often a major purchase, like a new car. He would walk into a dealership with his father's driver's license number and social security digit memorized, confidently filling out the loan application. He might even bring a female accomplice to pose as his father's wife, adding another layer of legitimacy to the transaction. The car would be driven off the lot, the loan papers signed in a stolen name, and the son would enjoy the fruits of his betrayal while the first payment notice was mailed to an address his father would never see. The emotional fallout when the deception was finally uncovered was nothing short of devastating. For the father, the discovery was typically twofold: a crushing financial blow and a profound sense of personal failure. The first he might learn of the fraud was a call from a debt collector about a car loan he never took out, or a rejection for a mortgage refinance due to a suddenly ruined credit score that had taken a lifetime to build. The initial confusion would quickly give way to disbelief, and then to a sickening horror as he traced the fraudulent accounts back to his own son. The psychological impact is difficult to overstate. This wasn't a random criminal, it was his child, someone he had raised, loved, and trusted implicitly. The betrayal cuts to the very core of a parent's identity, leading to agonizing questions. Where did I go wrong? Was I not a good father? How could my own son do this to me? The violation erodes the foundation of the entire family unit, often creating irreparable rifts between parents and turning siblings against each other as they take sides. The legal consequences presented a uniquely torturous dilemma for the victim. A father is faced with an impossible choice: press charges and see his own child prosecuted, potentially facing years in prison for felony identity theft and fraud, or attempt to handle the matter within the family, absorbing the massive financial losses himself. Many fathers, in a heartbreaking display of parental loyalty, choose the latter path. They drain their retirement savings, take out second mortgages, and sacrifice their own financial security to pay off the debts incurred by their son, all in a desperate attempt to keep their child out of the criminal justice system. This act of protection, however, often does little to repair the relationship and can even enable further destructive behavior. In cases where the father does pursue legal action, the family is often torn apart forever, with courtrooms and prison sentences becoming the final chapter in a story that began with a parent's unconditional love. This case stands as a somber reminder that the most secure vault in the world is no match for the trusted individual who already holds the key, and that the most damaging thefts aren't always about money, but about the trust that can never be fully repaid. He didn't need a hacker's technical skill or a corrupt official's inside access. His most powerful tool was his ability to command an audience and craft a reality more compelling than the truth. Our 18th case introduces a con artist who treated identity theft not as a clandestine operation, but as a grand performance, using the principles of stage magic and psychological misdirection to pull off some of the most brazen financial heists ever conceived. This was a criminal who understood that the easiest system to hack isn't a computer, it's the human mind. The mastermind, a man we'll call Sebastian Vale, was a professionally trained magician and mentalist who had spent years honing his craft on the less lucrative stages of dinner theaters and corporate events. He realized that the skills he used to entertain misdirection, suggestion, and the creation of absolute belief in an illusion were even more effective when applied to the world of high finance. His cons were never simple. They were elaborate theatrical productions where bank lobbies became his stage, and tellers and managers were his willing audience. Vale's primary method was what mentalists call cold reading, amplified by meticulous research. Before even entering a bank, he would use stolen personal details to learn everything about his target, their family members, recent vacations, purchasing habits, and even the name of their pet. Armed with this information, he could build an instant and seemingly supernatural rapport. One of his most famous schemes involved impersonating a high-net-worth individual who was supposedly in the midst of a complex international business deal. Vale would call the bank's premium client service line first, using a voice that was a perfect mimic of the actual client, a skill he'd developed for his mentalism act. He'd explain he was calling from a satellite phone on his yacht in the Mediterranean and needed to authorize a wire transfer for millions of dollars to close a deal. He would then send a flawlessly forged email from the client's account, complete with corporate logos and the digital signature the bank expected. But the true masterpiece was the follow-up. Knowing the bank would call the client's registered mobile number to verify, Vale used a call forwarding trick, a digital version of a magician's sleight of hand, to ensure that verification call was routed directly to his own burner phone. When the bank manager called, a confident Sebastian Vale would answer, verify the security questions with ease thanks to his research, and authorize the transfer. The money would vanish into an offshore account as completely as a rabbit disappearing from a hat. His live performances were even more audacious. Dressed in a tailored suit and radiating an aura of impatient wealth, he would walk into a branch and use a technique known as pacing and leading. He would start by stating verifiable truths about the account holder to establish credibility. "I see you still have the same lovely manager, Susan, who helped me with my estate planning last spring." Before introducing the lie he needed the banker to accept, "My brother is picking me up any minute for the airport, so I need $5,000 in cash from my safe deposit box immediately." He used physical misdirection, perhaps fumbling with his keys or creating a minor distraction, to swap a fake ID for a moment or to get a glimpse of a password being typed. Bank staff, trained to be helpful and deferential to wealthy clients, were so disarmed by his confidence and charm that they often bypassed their own protocols, wanting to provide excellent service to someone who seemed so important and knowledgeable. He wasn't a thief to them, he was a valued customer in a hurry, and they were the heroes helping him solve a problem. The impact of his cons was uniquely frustrating for financial institutions. The losses were significant, but the greater damage was to their confidence in their own security and their employees' judgment. How could their training and verification systems be so thoroughly dismantled by nothing more than a convincing personality and a handful of personal facts? It forced an industry-wide re-evaluation of security, emphasizing that no amount of pressure from a client should ever override strict procedure. For Vale, the curtain finally fell due to his own performer's ego. He became overconfident and attempted the same character twice in the same city. A sharp-eyed teller recognized the pattern and the description, and when Vale launched into his well-rehearsed routine, the manager was waiting with silent alarm already pressed. His arrest ended a career that proved the oldest tricks in the book are often the most effective, especially when the audience is desperate to believe in the illusion of importance and authority. Even in a world of adult deception, the most unsettling cases can sometimes involve the youngest among us. We now turn to a profoundly disturbing and psychologically complex scenario, a sophisticated identity thief who hadn't even reached the age of majority. This is the story of a child, often operating from the family computer in their own bedroom, who methodically turned the personal information of their own parents into a tool for financial gain, exposing a unique blend of digital naivete and startling criminal sophistication. The setup for this kind of crime is terrifying in its domestic simplicity. The perpetrator isn't a shadowy figure on the dark web. It's a teenager, sometimes as young as 13 or 14, who is deeply immersed in digital culture. They understand the mechanics of online forms, credit applications, and e-commerce far better than their parents, whose financial lives are often an open book lying around the house. A social security number might be spotted on a tax document left on the kitchen table. A mother's maiden name is common family knowledge. A driver's license number is readily available in a parent's wallet, which is rarely locked away from their own child. This intimate access eliminates the biggest hurdle for most identity thieves, placing a treasure trove of data directly into the hands of someone with the technical skill, and sometimes the moral ambiguity to use it. The motivations behind a minor's foray into this type of fraud are rarely about survival or funding a lavish lifestyle in the traditional sense. More often, the driving forces are powerful social pressures and the immediate gratification offered by online marketplaces. A teenager might be desperate for the latest gaming console, a high-end graphics card, or the social status that comes with expensive designer clothing and sneakers. Seeing no easy way to acquire these items through a part-time job or an allowance, they see their parents' credit as an effortless solution. The psychological impulse is a dangerous combination of entitlement and an underdeveloped understanding of long-term consequences. In their mind, it's not stealing in the same way taking cash from a wallet would be. It's a victimless digital transaction that their parents, who are seen as having endless resources, will barely notice. The methods they employ can be shockingly adept. They start by intercepting mail or monitoring their parents' email inbox for credit card pre-approval letters. They use their knowledge of family details to effortlessly answer security questions. They then apply for new credit cards online, having the digital cards instantly loaded into a mobile wallet for immediate use, or having the physical cards shipped to a friend's house or a local Amazon locker. They might use a parent's existing card information stored on a family computer to make online purchases, counting on the fact that many parents don't scrutinize every line item on their monthly statement, especially if they assume their spouse made the charge. The emotional and relational fallout when the deception is uncovered is uniquely devastating. For the parents, the discovery is a paralyzing blow that shakes the very foundation of the family. The initial shock of the financial loss is quickly eclipsed by a deep sense of betrayal, confusion, and painful self-recrimination. They are forced to grapple with agonizing questions. Where did we go wrong? Is this a reflection of our parenting? Is our child a criminal? The violation of trust is absolute, and it creates a rift of suspicion and hurt that can take years to heal if it ever fully does. Family life becomes a minefield of monitored devices and secret anxieties. For the child, the consequences extend far beyond a simple grounding. They are suddenly confronted with the very real-world impact of their actions that they had intellectually dismissed. They see the stress and heartbreak they have caused their family, the hours spent on the phone with banks and credit agencies, and the potential damage to their parents' financial stability. This confrontation with reality can be a profoundly traumatic wake-up call, sparking feelings of intense shame and remorse. However, it also presents a critical crossroads. This moment can either be a formative lesson in ethics and consequences that sets them on a straighter path, or it can cement a pattern of deceptive behavior, teaching them only that they need to be more careful next time. The legal response to such cases is a complex and delicate balancing act for authorities. Prosecutors are often extremely reluctant to pursue felony identity theft charges against a juvenile, recognizing that a criminal record could derail their entire future. Instead, the focus typically shifts to restorative justice and intense family counseling. The child might be entered into a diversion program requiring community service, mandatory financial literacy courses, and formal restitution agreements to pay back the stolen amount. The primary goal is rehabilitation, not punishment, aiming to address the underlying issues of impulse control, entitlement, and a lack of empathy that led to the crime in the first place. This case stands as a modern cautionary tale for the digital age, highlighting that the most dangerous security breach in your home may not be a weak Wi-Fi password, but a failure to teach the ethical boundaries that must accompany technological prowess. Yet even the shocking case of a teenager exploiting family trust cannot prepare us for a deception that weaponizes the most fundamental human instinct, the desire to care for a child. Our 20th case is perhaps the most psychologically complex and emotionally harrowing on our list, a story where identity theft was not used for financial enrichment, but as a means to fulfill a desperate and deeply flawed longing for motherhood. This is the account of a woman who systematically stole the identities of upstanding citizens for one singular, disturbing purpose: to pass the stringent background checks required to adopt children, building a family on a foundation of complete fiction. The individual at the center of this case, whom we will refer to as Laura, presented herself to adoption agencies and social workers as the picture of stability. She appeared to be a married, financially secure, and emotionally grounded professional, exactly the kind of prospective parent agencies hope to find. But every piece of her meticulously constructed identity was a lie. Her husband was sometimes an accomplice, sometimes a completely unaware man she had duped into a relationship. Her employment history, her income, her glowing letters of recommendation, all were forged using the personal and professional details of real people whose lives she had researched and plundered. She used their good names and clean records as a cloak of normalcy, designed specifically to deceive the very systems put in place to protect vulnerable children. Her motive remains a subject of intense fascination for psychologists and criminal profilers. Unlike the financial fraudsters we've discussed, Laura's driving force wasn't monetary gain. It was a powerful, LBIT Chinese letter, maternal desire, warped by a profound narcissism and an inability to navigate the legitimate adoption process, likely due to a criminal history or significant mental health issues that would have disqualified her. She didn't see these children as individuals to love and nurture. She saw them as objects, props in a performance of the perfect family life she felt entitled to. The act of deceiving the system likely provided her with a perverse sense of superiority and control, a way to prove she was smarter than the social workers and agencies that stood in her way. The trauma inflicted by this deception is almost unimaginable, and it rippled outwards to devastate multiple lives. The most immediate victims were, of course, the children. They were placed into a home with a woman who was, by her very actions, proven to be a master manipulator with a complete disregard for the law and the truth. Their sense of safety and stability was a complete illusion. When the deception inevitably unraveled, these children were subjected to the second profound trauma of their young lives, being forcibly removed from the only home they knew by Child Protective Services. They were not losing a fraudulent mother, they were losing the person they believed was their mother, their primary caregiver. This kind of attachment disruption can cause lifelong psychological scars, creating deep-seated issues with trust, abandonment, and identity. The collateral damage extended to the individuals whose identities were stolen. Imagine a woman receiving a call from an adoption agency, following up on a reference for a child she supposedly helped to adopt. The confusion would quickly turn to horror as she realized a complete stranger had not only used her name and professional reputation, but had also involved her, however unknowingly, in the placement of a vulnerable child into a potentially dangerous situation. The violation carries a unique and heavy guilt, the awful feeling that your good name was used to cause direct harm to an innocent. Furthermore, the adoptive families who had gone through the legitimate process were also victims. This case eroded public trust in the entire adoption system, making agencies more fearful, more cautious, and potentially slowing down placements for deserving parents, all because one individual exploited its vulnerabilities. Laura's house of cards finally collapsed under the weight of its own complexity. Managing multiple stolen identities and the care of several children is a logistical nightmare. A missed detail, a background check that finally verified an employer's phone number, a social worker who decided to make an unannounced visit and found a different husband in the home, or a credit check that revealed financial activity in a state where the identity thief was supposedly living triggered the investigation. The ensuing probe, led by adoption fraud units and federal law enforcement, painstakingly peeled back each layer of her fabricated life, leading to the heartbreaking removal of the children and her arrest on a multitude of charges including identity theft, fraud, and kidnapping. This case stands as a solemn warning that the most invasive theft isn't always of your money, but of your reputation, and that the most devastating lies are those told in the name of love. While the betrayal of a family's trust cuts deep, few deceptions provoke a more visceral and national outrage than the theft of valor. Our 21st case takes us into the heart of this sensitive territory, exploring the story of an individual who didn't just steal a name, but an entire legacy of service and sacrifice. This impostor assumed the identity of a genuine war hero, parading in stolen glory to claim unearned benefits, respect, and the heartfelt gratitude of a nation, all while spitting on the very principles of honor and integrity that define military service. The individual at the center of this scheme sought out a very specific kind of victim, a highly decorated veteran who had served with distinction but had since passed away or become reclusive. This careful selection was crucial. A living, active veteran would quickly notice discrepancies in their benefits or hear rumors of someone using their name. But a deceased hero's record is a static, sacred thing, a perfect target for a parasite looking to attach themselves to a narrative of courage they could never hope to earn. The impostor would first gather the veteran's personal data: name, date of birth, social security number, and military service number, often through online obituaries, ancestry websites, or by exploiting data breaches from veterans' organizations. With this information, they could then begin the process of building a fraudulent identity. The performance was often elaborate and convincing. The impostor would study the details of the veteran's actual service record, their unit, their deployments, the battles they fought in. They would memorize the specifics of their medals and the citations that accompanied them. They might even connect with real veterans groups online or in person, sharing war stories that weren't theirs to tell, basking in the respect and camaraderie offered by men and women who had genuinely risked everything. The goal was often multifaceted: to claim veterans' benefits like health care and disability payments from the Department of Veterans Affairs, to receive discounts and special treatment reserved for service members, and perhaps most disturbingly, to feed a pathological need for admiration and respect they had not earned. The impact of this fraud is profound and multifaceted, creating waves of damage that extend far beyond the financial. For the family of the actual hero, the discovery is a uniquely painful violation. The memory of their loved one, a source of immense pride and often profound grief, is suddenly hijacked by a charlatan. They are forced to watch a stranger profit from their family's sacrifice, telling lies about experiences that their father, brother, or son truly lived and may have been traumatized by. It feels like a second death, a tarnishing of a legacy that should remain pristine and honored. For the broader military community, the outrage is equally intense. The bond between service members is built on shared sacrifice and an unspoken understanding of the costs of war. When an impostor infiltrates this circle, it feels like a profound desecration of that trust. Real veterans, especially those suffering from the invisible wounds of war like PTSD, often see it as the ultimate act of cowardice. It devalues their own service and the memory of friends who never came home. The Stolen Valor Act, a federal law specifically designed to criminalize falsely claiming military awards or decorations for financial gain, exists precisely because these lies are considered so egregious. They strike at the very heart of what it means to serve with honor. The unraveling of these deceptions often comes from within the ranks themselves. Veterans have a keen ear for inauthenticity. An impostor might get a small detail wrong about life on a particular base, misidentify a piece of equipment, or be unable to describe the visceral, mundane realities of deployment that never make it into movies. A sharp-eared veteran might notice that the dates of service don't align with known unit deployments, or that the story behind a Valor Medal doesn't match the official citation. These small cracks are pursued with dogged determination by a community protective of its own. Through online forums, veterans networks, and direct reporting to the VA's Office of Inspector General, the truth is relentlessly hunted down. The subsequent investigation meticulously compares the impostor's claims with official military personnel records, leading to a very public and humiliating downfall. This case stands as a powerful testament to the fact that while medals can be forged and stories can be stolen, the unbreakable bonds of those who actually served will always be the most effective defense against those who would dare to pretend. Moving from the profound betrayal of stolen valor, we now shift to a case that feels almost quaint in its methodology, yet was executed on a scale so vast it nearly brought entire financial institutions to their knees. This is the story of an identity thief who bypassed the complexities of the digital age and returned to a classic tool of fraud, the humble paper check. But in his hands, this outdated instrument became a weapon of mass financial disruption, weaving a chaotic web of deception across dozens of banks and hundreds of unsuspecting businesses. The mastermind behind this operation, a man named Arthur Wimple, possessed a unique kind of criminal genius. He wasn't a hacker, he was a meticulous organizer and a master of logistics, treating his fraudulent enterprise with the cold efficiency of a factory production line. His entire scheme was built on a foundation of stolen identities, but with a very specific purpose. He didn't want to build a new life or assume someone's credit. He wanted to exploit the brief, fragile window of time between when a check is deposited and when it actually clears the banking system, a period known as the float. His weapon of choice was the bad check, and his ammunition was a seemingly endless supply of other people's names and bank account numbers. Wimple's method was a study in systematic exploitation. He first assembled a small team, each member with a specific role. One was tasked with acquisitions, gathering the raw materials, blank check stock, high-quality printers, and most importantly, the personal and banking information of hundreds of victims. This data was shockingly easy to acquire at the time through discarded mail, stolen payroll records, and even corrupt bank tellers. Another member of the team was the artist, a forger with a steady hand and an eye for detail, who could perfectly replicate the fonts, logos, and security features of checks from any major bank. The third member was the runner, the person who would actually go into the banks and businesses to cash the fraudulent instruments. The operation ran with relentless precision. Using the stolen identity of, for example, a respected local accountant named Robert Smith, the forger would print 50 perfectly crafted checks drawn on Smith's actual bank account. The runner, dressed in a respectable suit, would then embark on a carefully planned route, hitting 10 different branch locations of the same bank in a single day. At each branch, he would cash a check for a few $100s, an amount large enough to be worthwhile but small enough to avoid triggering mandatory manager approvals. He'd present a flawless fake driver's license bearing Robert Smith's name but his own photograph. The teller, seeing an account in good standing and a check that looked perfectly authentic, would hand over the cash. By the time the real Robert Smith noticed the inexplicable withdrawals or the bank's automated systems finally flagged the account for suspicious activity, the runner and his cash were long gone, already working their way through the next set of identities on the list. The impact of this kind of fraud is a tidal wave of administrative chaos and financial loss. For the banks, the damage was twofold. There was the immediate financial loss from the thousands of cashed bad checks, but the greater damage was to their operational confidence. How could so many tellers at so many branches be fooled? It forced a complete overhaul of check cashing protocols, the implementation of much lower thresholds for manager approval, and a new, pervasive sense of suspicion that slowed down transactions for every legitimate customer. For the businesses that unknowingly accepted these checks for payment, the loss was direct and painful. A furniture store might deliver thousands of dollars worth of goods only to discover days later that the payment was a complete fiction, leaving them with no way to recover their inventory or its cost. But the most devastating and often overlooked victims were the individuals like Robert Smith, whose identities were used as the engine of this scheme. Their lives were thrown into immediate and profound disarray. Their bank accounts were frozen, their credit was tangled up in the investigation, and they were inundated with calls from collection agencies and store owners demanding payment for purchases they never made. The process of clearing their name was a nightmare of bureaucracy, requiring them to file police reports, sign countless affidavits, and prove to a skeptical world that they were not the ones who had committed these crimes. The emotional toll was immense, a combination of violation, frustration, and a lingering fear that their financial identity had been permanently poisoned. Wimple's empire of paper finally crumbled under its own immense weight. The very scale of the operation, which was its greatest strength, also became its most glaring weakness. The pattern of identical fraud across multiple states finally coalesced in a federal database, painting a clear picture of a single, massive criminal enterprise. A multi-agency task force involving the U.S. Secret Service, the historic guardians of the nation's financial system, and the FBI tracked the intricate web of transactions. They followed the money from the bank branches to the runners, from the runners to the forgers, and finally back to Wimple himself, the architect who believed he could outsmart the entire banking industry with nothing more than good paper stock and a list of names. His arrest marked the end of one of the most extensive check fraud rings in history, a stark reminder that even the oldest tricks in the book can be updated for a modern scale of destruction. Yet even the breathtaking scale of Arthur Wimple's check fraud scheme pales in comparison to a case that stands apart not for its complexity or financial impact, but for its profound and gut-wrenching violation of history itself. We now arrive at a story that redefines the very meaning of moral bankruptcy, a deception so vile it transcends financial crime and enters the realm of a profound historical and emotional sacrilege. This is the case of a man who saw the unimaginable suffering of the Holocaust not as a solemn chapter in human history to be respected, but as an opportunity to be exploited, using the identity of a survivor to steal the meager restitution meant to acknowledge a pain that can never truly be repaid. The target of this scheme was a specific type of victim, an elderly Holocaust survivor likely living abroad whose records of internment in concentration camps were a matter of historical fact. These individuals, having endured the absolute worst of human cruelty, were sometimes eligible for restitution payments from the German government or various international funds, small, symbolic amounts of money that could never hope to compensate for their loss and trauma, but which represented a crucial, tangible acknowledgement of their suffering. The perpetrator, a man named Michael Kops, saw these payments not as a sacred debt but as a revenue stream. His method was as calculated as it was cruel. He would scour historical archives and online databases to find the names of survivors who had passed away, or he would identify those who were perhaps too frail or isolated to monitor their affairs closely. He would then assume their identities, using forged documents to file claims for restitution, effectively putting himself in line to receive money intended for those who had walked through the gates of Auschwitz and Bergen-Belsen. The psychological profile of such a criminal is a frightening study in a near-total absence of empathy. This isn't a crime born of desperate financial need. It is an act of profound narcissism and entitlement, a belief that one is somehow owed the recognition meant for those who suffered unspeakable horrors. Experts who study this specific niche of fraud often point to a deep-seated pathological greed, a mindset that views every human tragedy, no matter how vast, as a potential angle for personal gain. There is also often a twisted form of justification at play, where the criminal convinces themselves that the funds are just sitting there, that the real survivors aren't using them, or that they are somehow smarter for having found this loophole. This complete moral disengagement is what allows them to sleep at night, having commodified genocide for a quick profit. The impact of this theft is almost too heavy to measure. For the surviving family members of the actual Holocaust victim, the discovery is a shock that violently reopens generational wounds. To learn that a stranger has not only stolen their loved one's name, but has also profited from their suffering adds a bizarre and sickening new layer to their grief. The restitution money, however small, often held deep symbolic value. It was a final, official recognition of a truth that hateful regimes had tried to erase. To have that recognition stolen feels like the victim is being erased all over again. Their memory and their pain become a currency in the hands of a common thief. For the wider community of survivors and their descendants, this kind of fraud is a vicious attack on their collective memory and dignity. It feels like the ultimate act of disrespect, a final betrayal that says even their most sacred suffering is not safe from the avarice of the modern world. The unraveling of this particular deception is a testament to the diligent, painstaking work of international investigators and organizations dedicated to protecting Holocaust remembrance. The Conference on Jewish Material Claims Against Germany, often simply called the Claims Conference, has a special unit dedicated to fighting this exact type of fraud. Their investigators are historians and detectives rolled into one. They meticulously cross-reference new restitution claims against their vast archives of survivor records, looking for inconsistencies, a date of birth that doesn't align, a camp number that doesn't match the name, or a sudden claim filed for a survivor who had never before applied for restitution. In the case of Michael Kops, it was likely a pattern of suspicious claims that triggered the investigation. The subsequent probe, involving Interpol and multiple national law enforcement agencies, tracked the flow of money from the restitution funds to bank accounts he controlled, leading to his arrest and conviction. His case sent a powerful message that the world is watching, and that the memory of the 6 million would not be tarnished by the greed of those who would dare to steal from both the living and the dead. This story stands as the darkest example on our list, a chilling reminder that for some, there is no bottom, and that the most valuable thing you can steal is not a person's money, but their very right to have their suffering acknowledged. In an era where our most personal details are stored not in locked drawers but on vulnerable servers, the nature of identity theft has evolved into something far more scalable and sinister. Our 24th case catapults us into the modern digital battlefield, where the weapon of choice is no longer a stolen wallet but a corrupted database, and the thief isn't a lone grifter but a shadowy hacker who can steal 1 million lives with the press of a key. This is the story of a cybercriminal who didn't just assume one identity. He exploited a catastrophic corporate data breach to harvest a vast collection of them, treating people's most sensitive information as a bulk commodity to be packaged, sold, and weaponized on the dark web. The target was a major corporation, a household name like a credit bureau, a social media platform, or a health insurance provider that held the personal data of hundreds of millions of Americans. These entities are the de facto librarians of our digital selves, and their security, as this case proved, was a fortress with a shockingly vulnerable backdoor. The hacker's method was a chilling display of technical prowess combined with patient reconnaissance. The attack likely began with a technique called phishing, sending deceptive emails to lower-level employees that tricked them into revealing their login credentials or unknowingly installing malware. With a foothold inside the corporate network, the hacker could then move laterally, escalating his privileges through a series of exploits until he gained access to the crown jewels, the massive databases containing names, addresses, social security numbers, dates of birth, and even driver's license numbers. The actual exfiltration of this data was a masterclass in stealth. Rather than triggering alarms with a massive, sudden download, the hacker likely used a technique called data tunneling, subtly smuggling the information out over a long period disguised as normal network traffic. He might have compressed and encrypted the files, making them even harder for automated security systems to detect as they slipped through the firewall. The scale was almost incomprehensible. In a single operation, he wasn't stealing one identity. He was cloning the digital existence of over 100 million people, transferring the essence of their financial and personal lives onto a portable hard drive that he could carry in his pocket. This data then became his inventory, which he promptly offered for sale on encrypted dark web marketplaces, where other criminals could purchase these pristine identities in bulk for a few dollars each. The fallout from this kind of breach is a tsunami of fraud that washes over the entire country for years. The immediate impact is a wave of financial crime. Criminals who buy the data can instantly apply for credit cards, file fraudulent tax returns to steal refunds, and even take out payday loans, all under the stolen names. But the more insidious damage is long-term. With a complete set of personal information, a fraudster can perform what's known as a synthetic identity attack. They might combine a real social security number from the breach with a fake name and date of birth to create a completely new hybrid person who doesn't exist. They then nurture this synthetic identity for months, building a credit history before finally busting out with a massive loan they never intend to repay. This type of fraud is incredibly difficult to detect because it doesn't immediately victimize a real person. It creates a ghost in the machine that drains the financial system until it vanishes. For the millions of unsuspecting victims, the discovery is slow, confusing, and deeply invasive. There is no single moment of theft. Instead, they receive a form letter from the breached company months after the fact, informing them that their data may have been compromised. This vague language offers little solace and even less practical help. They are left with a lingering, low-grade anxiety, knowing that their most vital secrets are in the wild, a ticking time bomb that could detonate their credit at any moment for years to come. They are forced into a defensive posture, perpetually monitoring their credit reports, placing freezes on their accounts, and wondering every time the phone rings if it's a debt collector calling about a loan they never took out. The psychological burden is immense, a constant background hum of vulnerability imposed upon them by a faceless corporation's failure and a criminal they will never meet. The investigation into such a massive breach is a Herculean effort led by agencies like the FBI Cyber Division. Digital forensic specialists act as archaeologists of the incident, sifting through terabytes of server logs to find the hackers' digital fingerprints. They trace the path of the attack backward from the point of date at exfiltration through the compromised servers and eventually to the original point of entry. The hacker's downfall often comes from a tiny mistake reusing a password from an old, known account, logging in from his real home IP address just once, or transferring a fraction of his illegal profits to a cryptocurrency wallet that can be linked to his real identity. While the mastermind may eventually be caught and face decades in federal prison, the damage he unleashes is permanent. The stolen data, once released, can never be recalled. It circulates endlessly in the criminal underworld, ensuring that for his millions of victims, the breach is not a single event but a life sentence of vigilance. Imagine the identity thief not as a criminal seeking personal gain, but as a trained intelligence officer on a mission for a foreign power. This case moves us from the realm of financial fraud into the shadowy world of international espionage, where a stolen identity is not a tool for credit, but a weapon in a silent war. Our subject was no ordinary impostor. He was a highly disciplined agent, likely from a nation hostile to American interests, whose entire operation was funded and directed by a foreign intelligence service. His objective wasn't to empty bank accounts, but to infiltrate, gather secrets, and vanish without a trace, leaving a trail of borrowed lives in his wake. The identities he used were carefully selected for their blandness and utility. He didn't target celebrities or CEOs. He sought out what intelligence agencies call legends, utterly ordinary, unremarkable citizens whose profiles wouldn't attract a second glance. These were often people who traveled infrequently, had stable but low-profile jobs, and whose digital footprints were minimal. Using sophisticated hacking tools or perhaps through the aid of a corrupt official within his own country's passport agency, he would obtain the real birth certificate and vital records of an American who had died young or lived a very quiet life. This provided him with a clean social security number, the foundational key to the United States bureaucratic kingdom. With that, he could build a perfect, verifiable cover identity, complete with a driver's license, credit history, and even a seemingly legitimate employment record fabricated by his handler. His activities under these stolen names were meticulously planned to avoid financial fraud, which would create a digital trail. Instead, he used his false identities to rent apartments with cash, purchase untraceable burner phones, and establish low-level bank accounts just active enough to appear normal. These identities were his camouflage, allowing him to move through American society like a ghost. He might use one identity to get a job as a janitor at a defense contractor's office, another to be a delivery driver for a tech firm in Silicon Valley, and a third to simply blend in as a student at a major university known for its advanced engineering research. His goal was access physical or digital proximity to the people, buildings, and networks that held America's most guarded secrets. The national security implications of this kind of operation are staggering. Unlike a data breach that happens from thousands of miles away, a human intelligence agent on the ground can gather context and nuance that pure cyber espionage cannot. He could identify which employee at a research lab might be vulnerable to blackmail or recruitment. He could photograph the physical security layout of a sensitive government building. He could plant listening devices or use sophisticated equipment to intercept wireless communications from a parked car outside a corporate headquarters. Each piece of information, however small it seemed, could be a crucial part of a larger puzzle being assembled by analysts back in his home country. potentially giving them a significant military or economic advantage. This case likely came to light not through a routine credit check, but through the painstaking long-term surveillance efforts of a U.S. counterintelligence agency like the FBI. The agent might have made a tiny, almost imperceptible mistake, a single call placed from a burner phone to a known intelligence service number, a momentary lapse in his cover story under intense questioning at a border crossing, or being spotted on CCTV using two different identities in the same city on the same day. Once he was on their radar, a massive but invisible investigation would have begun, mapping his entire network of false identities and connections. His eventual capture would have been a quiet, clinical affair designed to maximize intelligence value, not a public spectacle. He would have been detained, interrogated, and ultimately used as a pawn in a diplomatic exchange for American assets held overseas, a silent conclusion to a shadow war the public never knew was being fought. This story serves as the ultimate reminder that identity theft is not always a crime of greed. In the right hands, it is a potent instrument of state power, and its theft can compromise the safety of millions. Even the most sacred spaces of trust are not immune to violation, as our next case demonstrates with chilling intimacy. This story moves us from the geopolitical stage to the quiet, confidential setting of a therapist's office, a place designed to be a sanctuary for vulnerability and healing. Here, a patient didn't just steal her therapist's credit card information. She embarked on a campaign to systematically become her, hijacking her professional identity in a bizarre and deeply damaging act of transference gone horribly wrong. The patient, a woman we will refer to as Chloe, had been seeing her therapist, Dr. Evelyn Reed, for years to address severe issues with identity and self-worth. Over countless sessions, she had poured out her insecurities, her aspirations, and her deepest fears, while Dr. Reed provided the steady, empathetic guidance that is the bedrock of effective therapy. This relationship, built on a profound power dynamic and a one-way mirror of personal disclosure, became the fertile ground for a dangerous obsession. Chloe didn't just admire her therapist's composure and professional success. She began to covet her entire life. She saw in Dr. Reed the stability and respect she felt she lacked, and in a twisted form of flattery, decided the only way to acquire those things was to simply take them. Her method was a slow, insidious process of information gathering and imitation. She noted the specific brands Dr. Reed wore, the way she styled her hair, and the cadence of her speech. But she moved far beyond mere admiration. She stole prescription pads from the office, fished mail out of the recycling bin, and used details casually mentioned in sessions like Dr. Reed's alma mater or her mother's maiden name to answer security questions. With this arsenal of personal data, Chloe began applying for credit cards, opening online accounts, and even attempting to secure loans, all under her therapist's name. The most audacious part of her scheme was her attempt to infiltrate the professional sphere. She created fake profiles on therapist referral websites using Dr. Reed's license number and began soliciting potential clients, diverting them to her own phone number in a delusional attempt to actually practice therapy herself. The psychological dynamics at play here are a classic, albeit extreme, example of a blurred boundary and a malignant form of identification. In therapy, a patient often idealizes their therapist, projecting onto them qualities they wish to possess. For most, this is a temporary and helpful part of the process. For Chloe, this idealization curdled into an envious desire to erase the boundary between them entirely. By stealing Dr. Reed's identity, she was attempting to literally become the object of her admiration, a drastic and dysfunctional effort to solve her own internal void by consuming the external life of another. It was an attempt to bypass the hard work of building her own identity by simply stealing a pre-made, successful one. The impact on Dr. Reed was devastating on both a professional and deeply personal level. The financial mess was a nightmare to untangle, but the emotional violation was far worse. The very tools of her trade, her empathy, her trust, her willingness to listen, had been weaponized against her. Her office, once a safe haven, now felt contaminated. She described a pervasive sense of unease, questioning her own judgment and safety. The betrayal forced her to confront a terrifying reality. The person she had dedicated herself to helping had been studying her not to heal but to hunt. For any mental health professional, this is the ultimate breach, shaking the foundational trust required to do their job effectively. The case also highlights the alarming vulnerability of therapists, who are often focused on protecting their patients' privacy while having their own personal information exposed and accessible in ways they might not anticipate. The scheme unraveled when Dr. Reed began receiving emails from confused individuals asking to confirm appointments she had never made. A call to one of these potential clients revealed the fake online profile, and the horrifying scope of the violation quickly became clear. Dr. Reed contacted authorities, and an investigation easily traced the digital activity back to Chloe. The aftermath was as complex as the crime itself. While Chloe faced legal consequences for identity theft and fraud, the case also prompted a painful but necessary ethical reckoning within the therapeutic relationship, forcing a closure that was far from healing for either party involved. This story stands as a sobering lesson on the fragile nature of professional boundaries and the terrifying potential for help to be perverted into harm. While the previous case explored the violation of a therapeutic relationship, our next story plunges us into a much broader and more ethically complex arena, where identity theft becomes entangled with one of the most contentious issues in modern America: immigration. This is the case of an identity thief who saw not just a credit score to plunder, but a desperate, captive market. He didn't just steal identities for his own use. He set up a black market operation, manufacturing and selling stolen or completely fabricated identities to undocumented immigrants who needed them to secure work and build a life in the shadows. The individual at the center of this operation, often referred to as a document broker, ran his business with the cold efficiency of an entrepreneur spotting a gap in the market. He understood that for undocumented individuals, obtaining a legitimate social security number was the key to everything: getting a job, renting an apartment, opening a bank account, and sometimes even obtaining a driver's license. His inventory came from two primary sources. The first was the classic method of identity theft, harvesting the social security numbers of real Americans, often children or the deceased, whose numbers were clean and inactive. The second, and even more brazen method, was pure fabrication. Using sophisticated software, he would generate realistic-looking social security cards and birth certificates, often pairing them with a real-looking name and photo to create a complete, albeit entirely fictitious, identity package. He then sold these packages for a premium, often several $1,000s each, to individuals who felt they had no other choice. The transactions were conducted in cash in parking lots or through a network of trusted intermediaries. For the buyer, this piece of paper wasn't a tool for fraud in their minds. It was a ticket to survival, a necessary document to provide for their family in a system that offered them no legal pathway. They used these stolen or fake numbers to fill out I-9 employment forms, fully aware they were breaking the law but believing it was the only way to feed their children. This created a tragic paradox. They were committing a federal crime simply to have the privilege of performing hard, honest labor that many Americans were unwilling to do. The ethical and legal dilemmas this case presents are a maze of conflicting principles and profound consequences. On one hand, the document broker is unequivocally a criminal. He is profiteering from the theft of innocent people's identities, causing the same financial and emotional havoc for his victims as any other identity thief. A child might discover their social security number has been used for years when they are denied student loans, or have their first job application rejected due to a mismatched employment history riddled with unpaid taxes. On the other hand, the immigrants who purchase these identities are not malicious actors seeking to defraud for gain. They are often victims themselves of poverty, of violence, of broken systems who are making a desperate choice under duress. The law, however, makes no such distinction. Purchasing and using a fraudulent social security number is a serious federal felony, punishable by fines, prison time, and almost certain deportation. This places the victims of the original identity theft in a uniquely frustrating position. Their financial lives are being damaged by someone they will never meet, for a purpose they might even sympathize with on a human level, yet which causes them very real harm. They are caught in the middle of a political and humanitarian crisis, their personal data becoming a tiny pawn in a vast national debate. For law enforcement, prosecuting these cases is incredibly challenging. Unraveling the scheme means confronting the very people who bought the identities, who are often terrified to cooperate with authorities for fear of deportation, making them difficult witnesses to secure for the prosecution of the higher-level broker. The broker's downfall typically comes from the same thing that fells most criminal enterprises: greed and overreach. As his operation expands, he becomes sloppy. He might use the same printer for multiple fake documents, leaving a forensic trail. A vigilant HR manager at a large company might notice the same social security number appearing on applications from multiple people with different names. Or an IRS audit, it might flag dozens of W-2 forms from different employers, all linked to a single number, indicating widespread misuse. A multi-agency task force involving the Social Security Administration's Office of the Inspector General and Homeland Security Investigations will then work backwards, following the chain of employment back to the individuals who used the numbers, and then back again to the broker who sold them. His arrest closes one operation, but it does little to solve the underlying problem that created the demand for his illegal service in the first place, leaving a trail of financial victims, terrified immigrants, and a deeply unresolved ethical question hanging in the air. Amidst the chaos of data breaches and high-tech hacking, one identity thief found a morbidly simple and consistently vulnerable target, exploiting a painful and inevitable human experience: the gap between a person's death and the slow-turning wheels of bureaucracy. This is the story of a criminal who didn't need to hack databases or trick the living. His entire operation was built on a grim daily ritual of scanning the obituaries, treating the local newspaper's death notices as his personal shopping catalog for fresh, pristine identities. His method was chilling in its simplicity and precision. Each morning, he would scour both print and online obituaries, searching for recently deceased individuals. He wasn't looking for just anyone, he had a specific profile. His ideal targets were middle-aged or elderly individuals who had led stable, financially responsible lives, possessed good credit, and most importantly, were survived by a grieving spouse who might be too distraught to immediately handle complex financial paperwork. The obituaries provided him with a goldmine of information: the full name, age, address, often the names of surviving family members, which were the answers to common security questions, and even the deceased's place of employment. This was more than enough to begin his work. Timing was everything. He understood the critical window of opportunity, the days or even weeks between a person's death and the moment their family finally mustered the strength to report the passing to the Social Security Administration, credit bureaus, and financial institutions. In this administrative limbo, the deceased's identity was still active. Credit reports were still clear, and credit card companies had no reason to suspect the account holder was gone. The thief would pounce within 48 hours of the death notice appearing. Using the information from the obituary, he would call the credit card companies listed in the victim's wallet, which he might have even stolen from the funeral home guest book, or that he found through pre-approved offers in their mail. Posing as the grieving widow or widower, he would report a card lost or stolen and request an expedited replacement to be sent to a new address, a P.O. box, or the address of an accomplice he controlled. The impact of this specific crime is a unique and cruel form of victimization that compounds grief with violation. For the surviving family, the discovery typically came weeks after the funeral, as the fog of sorrow began to slowly lift and they started the agonizing process of sorting through their loved one's financial affairs. They would receive a statement for a credit card they never knew existed, or a bill for a large purchase made days after the death. The emotional devastation is profound. It feels like a second loss, a brutal violation of their loved one's memory at their most vulnerable moment. The grief process is abruptly hijacked by anger, frustration, and a stressful bureaucratic battle to prove to skeptical companies that their spouse was already deceased when these transactions occurred. They are forced to produce copies of the death certificate over and over again, each request forcing them to relive their loss. This thief's downfall was ironically tied to his own morbid efficiency and the very human emotion he exploited, grief. A sharp-eyed funeral home director who had noticed a pattern of families mentioning strange credit card activity grew suspicious. He realized that many of these reports were linked to individuals whose services he had recently conducted. He contacted the local police, who were initially skeptical but discovered a pattern linking the fraudulent credit card shipments to a handful of P.O. boxes. A joint investigation with the Postal Inspection Service set up surveillance on these boxes. They eventually observed the thief retrieving his ill-gotten mail and were able to track him back to his home, which was found to be filled with stacks of obituary pages, stolen mail, and dozens of activated credit cards in the names of the dead. His arrest provided a small measure of justice, but his case remains a stark lesson in the persistent vulnerability that exists in death, a reminder that even in our final moments, we are not beyond the reach of those who would see us not as people, but as a collection of usable data. But perhaps the most comprehensive and personally devastating form of this crime occurs when a thief doesn't just target one individual, but systematically dismantles an entire family unit. Our final case is a masterclass in total domestic violation, the story of a criminal who saw a happy, stable household not as something to admire, but as a complete financial portfolio to be liquidated. This wasn't a smash and grab. It was a methodical, room-by-room looting of a family's entire financial existence, leaving nothing but scorched earth and broken trust in its wake. The schemer, a man named David Alve, wasn't an outsider. He was a trusted family friend, a charming and seemingly successful businessman who had ingratiated himself with the Millers over years of barbecues, birthday parties, and holiday gatherings. He was the kind of guy who always remembered the kids' names, offered to help with home repairs, and generously picked up the tab at restaurants. This deep, hard-earned trust was the master key that unlocked every door. Because he was so deeply embedded in their lives, he had effortless access to the information most thieves spend years trying to find. He knew the parents' dates of birth and social security numbers from helping them set up a new television. He knew the mother's maiden name from casual conversation. He knew when the teenage daughter got her first job, and he even helped the son fill out his first college financial aid form, thereby collecting every piece of sensitive data the young man possessed. Alve's scheme was a chillingly patient and comprehensive assault. He didn't just max out the parents' credit cards, he created new ones. He didn't just take out loans in the father's name. He established entire lines of credit with banks the family had never even heard of. But his true audacity was in targeting the children. Using the information he had gleaned, he applied for credit cards in the names of the Millers' 16-year-old son and 17-year-old daughter. Since they had no credit history to alert them, these accounts were approved with low limits, Alve, posing as the children, would make small, timely payments for months, nurturing these infant credit profiles into robust, high-limit scores worthy of a major financial hit. By the time the son was applying for his first car loan or the daughter was trying to secure an apartment after college, they discovered their credit was already obliterated by years of defaulted debt they never knew existed. The fallout was a special kind of hell that consumed the entire family dynamic. The initial discovery often came from a rejected mortgage application for the parents or a collections letter addressed to a child who was still in high school. The confusion quickly gave way to a sickening realization as they traced the threads of the fraud back to a single, familiar source, their friend David. The financial damage was catastrophic, totaling hundreds of thousands of dollars across all 4 family members, but the emotional damage was far worse. The parents were racked with guilt for having trusted the man who harmed their children. The children felt a deep sense of violation and anger, not only at Alve, but at their parents for having let this predator into their lives. The family home, once a place of safety, became a ground zero for anxiety, suspicion, and painful what-if conversations. The very bonds that held them together were stressed to the breaking point by the relentless stress of untangling the mess. David Alve's downfall was ironically tied to his own greed and the very technology he exploited. In his effort to manage the dozens of fraudulent accounts, he became complacent. He used the same IP address to access the parents' banking portal and the children's new credit card accounts. He had bills for all the fraudulent accounts sent to a single UPS store mailbox. This digital paper trail, once discovered by a forensic accountant hired by the family, became an undeniable map leading directly back to him. The ensuing investigation revealed a man living a double life, using the family's stolen financial stability to fund a secret gambling addiction and a second apartment. His arrest provided a measure of justice, but for the Miller family, the road to recovery was long. It took years of painstaking work with credit bureaus, lawyers, and financial advisors to repair their credit and their sense of security. Their story serves as the ultimate, chilling finale to our list, a stark reminder that the most valuable thing we own is our trust, and that once given to the wrong person, it can be used to steal everything else. What a journey through the shadows we've taken together. From teenagers in operating rooms to con artists selling fake countries, these 29 cases reveal a tapestry of human audacity that is both terrifying and fascinating. If there's one shocking theme that ties these stories together, it's the sheer intimacy of the crime. This isn't about stealing a thing you own, it's about stealing who you are. We've seen that the most dangerous thieves aren't always mysterious hackers on the dark web. They are brothers, trusted friends, respected police officers, and even grieving family members. The common thread is the exploitation of trust, the manipulation of our most basic human instincts to care for our families, to respect authority, and to help those in need. The nature of this crime is also evolving at a dizzying pace. We've moved from the lone wolf forging checks to sophisticated cybercriminals harvesting millions of identities in a single digital heist, and even to nation-states using identity theft as a weapon of espionage. The tools have changed from stolen mail to corrupted databases, but the core motivation remains a chilling constant: the desire to become someone else for profit, for power, or for perverse pleasure. This evolution means our defenses must be equally dynamic. Protecting yourself requires more than just a strong password. It demands a new mindset of healthy skepticism and proactive vigilance. So what can you do right now to build your own digital moat? First, make credit freezes your first line of defense. It's the single most effective step you can take. Contact the 3 major credit bureaus, Equifax, Experian, and TransUnion, and freeze your credit and that of your children and elderly relatives. This prevents anyone, including you, from opening new lines of credit until you temporarily lift the freeze, effectively locking the door that thieves most want to open. Second, become a relentless monitor of your digital life. Enable two-factor authentication on every account that offers it. Use a password manager to create and store complex, unique passwords, and scrutinize your bank and credit card statements every month without fail. Don't just glance at the total, look at every single transaction. Finally, practice the principle of minimal disclosure. Why does a retail store need your zip code? Why does an online quiz need your mother's maiden name? Every piece of data you give out is another puzzle piece for an identity thief. Be stingy with your personal information. The stories we've shared today are extreme, but they started with the same small data points we casually hand over every day. Your identity is your most valuable asset. Guard it with the seriousness it deserves. If any of these stories hit close to home, we want to hear from you. Share your own experiences or close calls with identity theft in the comments below. Your story could be the warning that helps someone else. And for more deep dives into the strangest corners of American history and crime, make sure to hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell. The world is full of bizarre facts, and we're just getting started. Thanks for watching.